Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I am your host, Brian Gracely. And as we talked about at the top of the show, we are going to talk a little bit about the transition that's now going to happen over the next month or so from Adam Selipsky being the CEO of Amazon Web Services to Matt Garmin taking over the role of CEO. This was just announced this past week by Amazon CEO Andy Jassy. And, it's not something that, while any sort of change for a leading organization is a huge deal. I want to say this is not totally surprising. So let's kind of walk through some basic things. 2021, Jeff Bezos steps down as CEO of Amazon. Andy Jassy, who had previously been CEO and been running Amazon Web Services, takes over the lead role at Amazon. In his place, there was a lot of speculation about who could possibly take that role. There was a lot of people at Amazon Web Services who had been there for a number of years, a number of people who had been invisible and prominent roles. But they decided to go outside the organization. They went with Adam Selipsky, who had previously been CEO of Tableau. He had previously been at Amazon Web Services for a number of years. I think he had been there for about 10 or 12 years. So he wasn't completely unfamiliar with the organization, but he had been at Tableau, leading data visualization company for a number of years, been CEO of that role. And it was interesting. I think the biggest kind of surprise when Adam was announced was that Amazon didn't stay internal to the organization, didn't stay internal to AWS to select their next leader, but they went to somebody outside the organization. And this is one of those situations in which, if we step outside of the Amazon AWS context, it's always interesting if you follow, leadership hires, regardless of what area this is, whether it's technology or sports or manufacturing or finance, whatever it might be. Whenever you hire someone to take over a leadership role, there's always a couple of things that you're looking for, right? One of them is familiarity with the industry. You don't necessarily want to pick somebody who is completely foreign to the industry, although we have seen this in a number of cases. A couple that come to mind. Ford Motor at one point in time hired a new CEO who had been with Boeing, so had been in the transportation business, but not necessarily in the automotive business. Red Hat had hired Jim Whitehurst, who had been in a number of high-level consulting roles, had been at Delta Airlines previously, to take over when he took over Red Hat more than, I think, 2 decades ago or so. So, there's been lots of examples of people who have come from other industries who have been CEOs and have taken over certain kinds of challenges in the past. So oftentimes, what people tend to look for when they're looking for new CEOs or new leadership is a couple of things. Obviously, you want them to have had leadership experience at some high level. You want them to have shown, excellence and results and accountability over periods of time. So this is, where you don't oftentimes necessarily see somebody who had, been somewhere for 6 months or something like that. You're looking for longer term accountability and experience at the highest level. You're looking for somebody who, is charismatic, can lead, can inspire people. And so this is, where you got into a situation in which you can oftentimes have a situation in which the CEO or the leader has been there for a long period of time. And while they have a number of excellent people on their team, or as people like to say, a deep bench, sometimes it's hard for people to visualize, well, what would the company look like with somebody else from internal to the corporation running it, because they haven't been at the highest level, right? And so this is very likely what happened when Adam Selipsky was hired. Was they needed somebody who could check the box that they understood the Amazon culture, the 14 or 17, whatever kind of rules they live by, but also knew the AWS culture, which obviously was going to be somewhat different than the Amazon culture that did retail or other types of things. And Adam checked both those boxes. They probably went back and forth about whether or not that person had to have been a CEO previously, because I think even if we go back a little bit in time, Andy was not named CEO of Amazon Web Services until the last couple of years. Right? He was president of Amazon Web Services, or senior vice president of Amazon Web Services, but he wasn't CEO. And I think once Amazon reached a certain threshold, in which not only was he incredibly visible to the company, Amazon Web Services was sort of the profit engine of the company, and that became sort of visible to the company. Was he named CEO? So, the question of, does the next person have to be CEO, probably was one of those, like, it's on the list, but is it the most important thing to have on the list? And so that was probably one of the things in which, when they were looking at Adam versus somebody else. But anyways, they ultimately hired Adam Selipsky, kind of a little bit of a head scratcher, not a complete head scratcher, because again, he checked certain boxes. As the CEO of Tableau, he wasn't necessarily a well-known commodity. He wasn't somebody who you were like, oh, what did that CEO of Tableau say recently? What was Tableau doing to sort of shape the industry? But they were a cloud company. Again, he had he had been a CEO and sort of lived in that chair and understood what it meant to walk in those shoes. But it also was a very interesting decision to not hire internally within AWS, because AWS always positioned themselves as, we think differently, right? We are differently than most technology organizations, most tech vendors, and so forth. And so, you did kind of expect that they would have hired somebody internally. So, anyways, as Adam came in, I think the first thing that we all talked about was, these are very difficult shoes to fill, right? As our friend Brandon Witcher loves to say, Andy Jassy is a first ballot Hall of Famer for the sort of tech Hall of Fame, tech leadership Hall of Fame. He built the business from essentially scratch, and he probably gets more credit than he deserves in terms of the overall organization. But when you're the face of the organization, you get more credit, and you also get more blame for the organization. So, he was there from the beginning, helped build the organization, was part of Jeff Bezos, the highest level teams. I think they call them S teams at Amazon. And so he was really the face of it. And Andy was, very much somebody who was able to convey the idea that Amazon, and Amazon Web Services were reshaping the industry. They were offering something unique and different in the marketplace. While his style, was his style, it would probably borderline on a little bit smug, sort of smartest guy in the room, didn't necessarily seem like the life of the party, was different than many other people, was different than a Steve Ballmer, different than a Bill Gates, different than a John Chambers, or some of the others that we think of, a Larry Ellison. But he had his own style, and he committed to that style, and he owned that style. And his results were outstanding, right? They became the 800-pound gorilla in technology, in IT, so following in his steps was always going to be a really, really hard thing to do. And our advice is always and this advice probably only applies to maybe like one person listening to the show, or three people, or whatever. If you ever get the chance, if you are somebody listening to the show who has the opportunity to be the man that replaces the man, be very careful about that. There's, so many examples of this, whether it's, the person that follows, the person that followed Bill Gates, right? Steve Ballmer wasn't the CEO that Bill Gates was, even though he was, there every day and should have just known what to do, right? Chuck Robbins has not been the CEO that John Chambers was at Cisco. He's been very good. Yes, he's been very good, but not that. And again, some of this is timing, and I don't mean to call out either one of those. But being the man that follows the man, or the woman that follows the woman, is incredibly difficult, right? The expectation is that the person before you has built such an incredible organization that you should just be able to follow that along, right? Same level of growth, same level of success, same level of championships, whatever you're chasing. The expectation is that you will continue to be able to be the same sort of leader, motivator, innovation driver, whatever those sort of things might be. And again, so many things are time-based. They are situational based. They are whatever. And so, Adam steps into this situation, and, if you think about the situation and you said, hey, wouldn't it be great to be the CEO of Amazon Web Services, especially when things are really good? If you had that conversation with somebody in 2017 or 2018 or even 2019, you'd have said, boy, that would be a fantastic job. You seem to have tons and tons of resources. You are surrounded by incredibly smart people who are cranking out innovation. Customers seem to love what you're doing. You're growing at a record pace. And so you've got resources available from your company. And then we step into 2020 and COVID comes along, and 2021 happens, and the pandemic is in this very unusual, uncertain state. And you take over, for somebody who is, again, sort of first ballot Hall of Famer in Andy Jassy. And the situation is one in which, probably in the original early days in which he took over, things probably seemed great, because not only were we seeing tons and tons of companies moving more and more things at a rapid pace into the cloud because of the pandemic, because people were working from home, because companies couldn't get into their data centers for all sorts of reasons. If you go back and look at the growth of all the cloud companies, um, they were growing like crazy, because we had to adapt to a near term challenge in terms of the pandemic and where we were working, and what was happening to various types of applications that had to scale and so forth. But at the same time, and companies were spending to stay alive, right? And then you had sort of, we were still in the ZIRP days, the sort of zero interest rate days, and then you had all sorts of government funding that was sort of backing the economies around the world in order to stay around. So you had this tsunami of good situations going on, especially as the CEO of a cloud company. So you had tons of money, tons of free money. Your customers are spending like crazy. They're having to move to your environment because circumstances have driven into that environment. And so initially it's like things are great, right? And the results are pretty darn good, right? It was 62 million or 62 billion. I went back and looked at the numbers. 62 billion in 2021, $80 billion in sales in 2022. So things were growing, right? And you were still growing at a very fast rate. Everybody thought, well, maybe this is just the new world. This is the way things are going to be. And so if you're in that situation, you're going, wow, I'm riding on the back of a wave and things are going great. And then reality sits in. And we've seen interest rates change. Interest rates have gone up. We've seen companies, and probably the biggest headlines for the last couple of years for an AWS has been, customers are having to rationalize their spend. They're having to right size their spend. They're cutting back on things. They are cost cutting, if you will, or whatever. And this wasn't just sort of speculation. This was explicitly called out in places. And so you go from, what feels like very easy sailing to difficult sailing. And not that AWS wasn't growing. I mean, if you look at their last 4 or 5 years, 2021, 62 billion, 2022, 80 billion, 2023, 90 billion, 2024, they're up over 100 billion run rate, probably close the year at like 110 or something like that. So you're still making a ton of money, but you've got 2 or 3 real challenges, right? The first is the guy who used to do your job is still your boss, right? So Adam Selipsky is still reporting to Andy Jassy, who knows AWS's business better than anybody, and is a well-known, detail-oriented person. Now he's got much more on his plate, but he's obviously keeping an eye on you, because AWS is the profit center of Amazon, right? It's the area that is the most profitable area of any of the areas, although probably things like advertising are doing very well. So you've got that challenge. The second challenge you have is the environment changes very quickly. And if we think back on the last 2 or 3 years, 3 or 4 years of Amazon Web Services, you would be very hard pressed. And I'm sure there are people within Amazon who are, maybe listening to this and going, but we build cool stuff and my group built cool stuff. There isn't a headline of anything that AWS came out with over the last 2 or 3 years that really stands out, right? To a certain extent, Amazon Web Services built every capability that you needed from 2011 to 2020 or 2021 from an infrastructure perspective, and a little bit from an application perspective, database perspective, and so forth. But the last 2 or 3 years have been very blah, very, very mid, as the kids would like to say. So, whether that is because, and we've talked about this on the show, because your focus is now, I have to be the growth engine. We're going to make more conservative decisions that we know are sort of sure bets for revenue, or whether when you took over, there was enough people that left, as there's been some high profile people leaving across all the cloud providers, but AWS as well. You lost some of your innovation engine, whether it was decisions that you made, whether it was things that you inherited. The Adam Selipsky era ultimately is going to be characterized as meh, just nothing really happened during his era. No big announcements really came out. The perception of AWS didn't really change. In fact, if anything, now that we are in the AI era, the beginning of the AI era, most of the conversations about AWS are you are in third place, fourth place, fifth place from an AI perspective. And again, a lot of these things are sort of outside of Adam's control. If you think about the models, the size of the models that have to be created, the foresight to projected generative AI and all these sort of things, those are things that would have happened all the way back to Andy Jassy's reign. But Adam took over in 2021. Late 2022, we get ChatGPT. How much people were aware of that? Obviously, not very much, because the industry is kind of scrambled like crazy to figure out what to do with that. But he is ultimately getting blamed for AWS having a just sort of average AI strategy. And again, the horse racing analogies that are going on around the AI strategies are really sort of interesting, because we tend to say, hey, so-and-so is doing well, so-and-so is not doing well. But we could look at really any cloud provider's AI strategy at this point and sort of go, yeah, it's got its goods and bads. And we could do a show on that. We may end up doing a show on that here coming up pretty soon. But he's going to get blamed for that as well. And so, ultimately, you lacked leadership, you lacked personality, you really didn't motivate and lead in any interesting way. And so the Adam Selipsky era is going to come to an end, and people are going to look back at it and go, oh yeah, there was that 3-year period where that guy was CEO, and probably not much else. I hate to be sort of harsh about that, but that's probably, how it'll get written. He'll get blamed for some AI stuff. He will get blamed for slower growth, which again, the circumstances of being CEO is you have to own everything, the goods and the bads. Couple of little things that I'll throw out in terms of the differences and things that you can control as coming in and CEO, especially if you come in as CEO of a big organization. And this is going to be one of those ones that probably, I'm sure, various leadership coaches would differ on in terms of opinion. But a lot of times people are going to come in and say, hey, come in and be the leader that you are, be your person. Because if you're not your person, if you're not authentic, it's going to show. One of the first things that he did when he came in, and all of us, we sort of look at announcements and we look at all sorts of things and we analyze them like the Zapruder tapes. When he first came in, if you went and looked at Andy Jassy's Twitter bio or X bio, and again, these are super minutia things, but they do sort of get at certain things. Andy says lead Amazon, married and father of 2 kids, big sports music film fan, experienced buffalo wing eater. And I think it used to say lead AWS, and then so on and so forth. And so there's a little bit of, if you sort of psychoanalyze this, he doesn't say CEO of Amazon. He doesn't say CEO of AWS. He says lead, right? And so there's a certain amount there that is, hey, titles don't matter as much to him. It's the function of the role, right? And then he's got in there, experienced buffalo wing eater, which is his being like, I'm a man of the people, right? I get in there, I get things done. I have life experiences that I can share with people. Adams, when he first was CEO, and again, this might have carried over from his Tableau days. The thing that jumped out to me, and he's since changed it, was it used to say wine guy. And we used to joke that Andy said wings guy and his said wine guy. And again, it was one of those things where that might be his thing. He might love, fine wines and the nicer things in life and so on and so forth. But as a little bit of sort of read the room of the guy who preceded you runs, a tech industry thing that is infrastructure centric. He sort of positions himself as sort of man of the people, and you're positioning yourself as sort of an elite. And it was a super small, nuanced thing. He's since changed his to husband and dad, water skier, tennis player, fan of the Seahawks and the Sounders, which are the sports teams in Seattle, CEO at AWS. And again, in terms of, minor, psychoanalysis, Your boss says the first thing that characterizes him is he leads the organization, and then he's a father, and then he plays sports, and then he's a man of the people. Your order says husband and dad, water skier, tennis player, which is your hobbies, fan of the local sports teams, which is great. And then the fourth thing is CEO of AWS. And it does sort of make you go like, well, are those your priorities? Because most people, if you talk to the folks at AWS, or at Amazon, if you've ever interviewed there or if you talk to them, their priorities are, work, sort of family, hobbies, and so forth. And you've flipped the order for that. And again, that might be who you are, and that's what you do. But it is a weird thing to signal to people that that's your priorities when you've taken over what is now $100 billion business and the most important business to one of the most important or largest companies in the world, right? Small little nuance things there. But again, when you think about what are you representing to a large number of people, what are you communicating up to your boss? And these might have had nothing to do with how he ran the organization or how he communicated things, but those are the things that he put out into the world that the world can see, that are public to people. I thought there was a couple of interesting points in the announcements that were made. And I've heard this mentioned, and we've talked about it on various things. Andy says, I've always had a lot of respect for Adam. We met several times to discuss the possibility of coming back to lead AWS. In those conversations, we agreed that if he accepted the role, he'd likely do it for a few years, and that one of the things he'd focus on during that time was helping prepare the next generation of leadership. Now, if you've read enough corporate policy, enough corporate PR, enough press releases, or you've talked to Amazon people, there's not one bit of that in terms of he'd likely do it for a few years that any of us believe. Because if you are the person that runs and is the steward of a gigantic organization that is the envy of the industry, and you're looking for somebody to take that over, and you are maniacally passionate about it, you talk about it being, the thing that defines you, and then you go, oh, I'm just going to hand this over to somebody who might do it for a few years. I don't believe that for a second that was the conversation. I think that's a nice cover for why you're letting him go and not saying we're firing him. But the fact that they put that in there is very odd. It's very weird. It speaks a little bit to, yes, you're trying to be nice about it, but you could just say you could have said a lot of things, but signaling to the organization that you hired somebody that was sort of, in it to do it part-time or just to do it for a couple of years and then sort of move on is a very weird statement. And if we flip that with what he says about the incoming new CEO, Matt Garmin, Matt has an unusually strong set of skills and experiences for this new role. Unusually strong. I don't think I've ever seen that written before, but unusually strong set of skills and experience for this role. It makes you wonder a little bit if he actually was the person that got to decide who the person should be to run AWS, because Matt Garmin, by most people's, sort of insider insight, for those that really knew Amazon, he was the guy that they expected. So it's strange that he's now saying he has an unusually strong set of skills and experience for this new role. He's very customer focused, terrific product leader, inventive, a clever problem solver, write a lot, and has high standards and meaningful bias for action. Now, those things might be absolutely everything about Matt Garmin. And they might also be a very passive-aggressive way of saying the previous guy wasn't very many of these things. So it's a very interesting contrast between the two. It very well might be as blatant as it seems to be, but it's a very weird way to write out the two people. Didn't thank him for his time, didn't thank him for his his efforts to grow the organization, just said he was going to stick around. And then the new guy is everything that Amazon stands for, everything about Amazon's culture. He's inventive. He's a terrific product leader. He's a clever problem solver. He's write a lot, meaningful bias for action, customer focused. Very, very, very weird contrast between the two ways that Andy Jassy talks about the old guy and the new guy. Anyways, just a very interesting time. I think the last thing to take away from this is, if we think about the timing of this, Amazon's in a very kind of weird position, because on one hand, they are still the leaders. They are still, by all accounts, far ahead of number two Microsoft. Even the weird way that Microsoft does accounting, they are ahead of Microsoft. But this AI thing, this new era of AI, and whether the cloud matters as much as it did, if the cloud just becomes a feature underneath AI, or if AI, ends up being a smaller trend than we expected, we don't know. But to a certain extent, we're seeing some things happen in which, the phrase that's talked about across the industry is sort of wartime CEO versus peacetime CEO. And again, they're just terms that sort of explain the level of competition in the marketplace. It has nothing to do with sort of the current events that are going on around the world, which are, horrible and terrible and all those sort of things. But it also does sort of convey the idea that Selipsky may very well have been a interesting peacetime CEO. Essentially, the company's growing. It's just sort of growing. It's a flywheel. It's going to continue to grow. And a very clear signal to the marketplace that, we are in a time of change, significant change. What's going to be certain amounts of chaotic change. There are going to be some very big strategic decisions that are going to get made both by Amazon, but also by their competition. And, whether Amazon goes back to no longer recognizing their competition, or, distinctly sort of, fighting against and acknowledging their competition, we'll see. But this very much does feel like the acknowledgement that a lot of us have seen in the market, that this new era in which AI is a defining thing, and the things that go around AI will be important enough to make leadership changes. And, Amazon probably could have stuck with Adam Selipsky as the CEO and continued to grow. And a couple of years from now, we just said, oh, they're a $150 billion business. But I think the recognition that the dynamics of AI are not just, this is a new technology, but this is a significant shift in the marketplace that will have impacts up and down the stack, impacts in the go-to-market, impacts in partnerships, impacts in investment levels. And it feels like they're getting back to the idea that the people that can run Amazon Web Services are the people that know Amazon Web Services the best, and not just any leader who is familiar with the area, familiar with sort of the technology domain, but doesn't really understand, what Amazon does. So it's going to be very interesting to watch and see how the new guy does. By all means, by all accounts that I've seen, the people that have interacted with Matt are, impressed with him. Again, taking over the chair, being a great product manager, being a great sales leader doesn't by any means guarantee that you will be a great CEO. We've seen this in many cases. But, for somebody who has been around the DNA of the organization as much as Andy was, he's probably a much closer kind of check the box person than bringing in somebody from the outside. So anyways, lots of talk on that. Will be very, very interesting to watch this, but I think it will be very interesting. We've got 5 months, 6 months until the reInvent keynote. We will all sort of watch with bated breath to see what the new style will be that will be communicated. Obviously, Andy had his style. Adam had a very uninspiring style, much less innovation, much more sort of allowing customers to just sort of tell their story, shorter keynotes, less sort of we're the smartest people in the room, less we are driving the marketplace, and more just, what I say, what I sort of characterize as like you're just sort of reading the annual report out to people, as opposed to motivating and leading people. So it'll be very interesting to see if that leading innovation, sort of we're the best, we are driving the market, we are defining the market, comes back to the keynote and across the ways that AWS has done this, or if AWS is now in a position in which they're very unfamiliar, which is they're not leading, they're not defining the market, they are not they're not the first choice for innovative companies. We'll see if AI changes things. So anyways, it's a milestone. It's a mark, a long history. We'll see whether it's a significant change at AWS, or just the beginning of maybe, every 3 or 4 years they'll have new leadership, right? Either of those possibilities are very possible, but we'll see where it goes. So with that, wrap it up. Thank you all for listening. Hope you're all having a great week. Thanks again for listening to this Weekend Perspective. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the show. Thanks for helping us be part of the community. And with that, we'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.